Okay, I'm doing the part three communication skills of our Anglo-Saxon test, and I've decided to go with option four, which is the one about the dream of the Rood. And I chose this one because for a variety of reasons. One, I've done a lot of research on this particular work because it's the class when I give a presentation on. Furthermore, I think it's probably, with the exception of Beowulf, I think it's the most interesting work that we've studied so far, in my opinion. So, you asked us to defend one of the interpretations that you have given us, and I believe the one that I wanted to defend is has the cross become one with Christ? And I believe that as you go through this work, that theme or that interpretation becomes very transparent. Line after line, really. And that's kind of how I've decided to defend this argument, is going line by line. Um, so that's what I'm doing basically here. And for the record, I'm using a translation by Richard Hamer. It's the same translation that we used in our class presentation. I looked the guy up. He's a professor. He's a very well-renowned historian or whatnot. So without any farther ado, here I go. So as you look on line 20, it says that the cross began to bleed on its right side. And that's, I mean, obviously that's a parallel between Jesus and Christ bleeding on his right side. And then as you go on to read another portion, it talks about how both cross and the Christ became wet all over with blood. And I mean, that kind of solidifies this theme of unity or interpretation of unity that they have together. Um, yeah, they're really like they're sharing this moment and sharing their experience. They're one in this experience, and I mean, I don't see how you can get any more intimate than the sharing of blood. They're wet all over with blood. And then the second thing is you as you keep on reading, uh, the tree or the cross was cut down at the corpse's end, moved from its root, moved from its home, just as Christ was moved from his home with God above in heaven. That's another parallel that I found. And then and this is obviously in the Cross's monologue to the dreamer. He says that he was made a spectacle as men. 35 of them carried the me on their shoulder to a big hill, and that's kind of, I mean, they made the cross a spectacle, if you will, just as Christ was made a spectacle as he was naked and beaten and wearing a crown of thorns. They're both made a spectacle in this experience. Yet he goes on to say that the cross did not bend, nor did it break in the face of overwhelming adversity, fear, terror, even. And this is similar to how the Christ did not waver in this moment of great trepidation. So, on to that. Then you read how he says, I trembled as the warrior embraced me. So Christ is embracing the cross at this moment. This is yet another very intimate moment of becoming one in their experience, one in their passion, whatnot. And then on to that, I mean, it says the warrior. This is kind of typical of an Anglo-Saxon story, kind of giving Christ, who's kind of the hero of this story, a waristic nature, if you will. So then they go on to talk about how the cross, it was pierced with dark nails. Um, both the tree, both the cross and Jesus are pierced with these nails, and they both have scars from these. If you look at Christ, they talk about the scars on his hand, on his palm. The cross also had scars from these nails, open wounds of malice, as they say. Yeah, and they were both they were reviled by these men. So then moving on, they talked about in this moment of agony, they were in their place together as they wept together. Obviously, that's giving kind of human characteristics to the tree. Yes. And then they were both buried together. They talk about how the tree was cut down and buried just as Christ was buried. Yet they were both resurrected together. Resurrection, I think I looked up the definition, and it's the idea or concept of the living coming back to life after death. And obviously the tree It's more pronounced with Christ as he was coming back up from death. But with the tree, it was also coming back to life in a form. It was coming back from being buried to all of a sudden being unburied and being able to speak. And it kind of personifies this tree as living and as life. So onward to that, it talks about how the king exalted me above all trees, just as the Almighty God exalted his mother above all trees. But I think also you can kind of draw a parallel between the tree being honored above all trees, just as Christ is honored above all men. So I believe that kind of makes it very clear. I think it's difficult to deny the reality that one possible interpretation of this poem is, hey, these trees are, these two people, this Christ and the tree are one in their experience, one in their passion, one in their suffering. It's very apparent. It's very transparent as you go through this poem. Now, one interesting thing that you mentioned during our class presentation was the possibility of an animistic nature, animistic belief. And I believe that also in your the option 4, you say defend your position. And I think one of the most effective ways to defend your position is mentioning, another possible interpretation, and then saying why I believe that that's not the correct interpretation in this particular situation. So you say, is the cross a deity? And basically that's saying, is the cross have a godly nature to it or whatnot? And I believe that yes, to some degree, the cross is, the tree is given this godly nature to it, this animistic nature that is the spiritual nature of natural objects. And I believe I have one of the lines that says, that far and wide on earth men honored me and all this great and glorious creation. So it's kind of like the tree is being honored by men. And I see how you can draw that comparison. Perhaps there's an animistic nature about that. But I don't feel like in this particular poem or in this work, it's true for a variety of reasons. First, I think in Beowulf, they talked about how some of the men in Hero were like, honoring things that weren't God above. And then they went on to that to talk about how the men were stupid, or they kind of denounced the men for doing that. And I feel that because this is a Christian poem, because this is written by or scribed by Christian monks or whatnot, I feel like had they been emphasizing that nature of men honoring the tree, I feel like they would have gone on to say, oh, and this is not what you should do. This is the wrong way to do, just as they did in Beowulf. They talked about how this is not the way to do. The men were silly or stupid in their ways of doing that. So that's one thing. And then secondly, I feel that by honoring the cross, I feel like the cross is a representation of Christ. I spent the last 7 minutes talking about how the Christ and the cross are kind of one. And I feel like by honoring the cross, you're not really honoring the cross. You're honoring Christ above. And that's different than honoring a gold statue or a gold whatnot, because if you're honoring a gold statue, you're honoring that gold statue. I think by honoring the tree or honoring the cross, you're honoring the cross, but you're really you're honoring Christ, but you're honoring Christ through that cross. And I think that's different than honoring just any old natural object. So I don't believe that this poem really has an animistic nature about it for those reasons. Yes, and I think that's pretty much about it. As I said, I think it becomes very obvious when you're reading this poem that the most transparent interpretation is that which is the cross and the Christ are one in their experience. They're really unified throughout this poem. So yeah.